I want to share with you some very interesting results that were just published on the use of deliberate cold exposure to benefit fat loss. Deliberate cold exposure can be done by way of cold showers or immersion in cold or ice water up to the neck. That's typically the ways that it's done. It has been shown to reduce inflammation, to increase metabolism, and I think some of the most exciting results that have been published are the results, certainly in humans, showing that deliberate cold exposure can increase the release of so-called catecholamines, which are dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and those increases in those three molecules are quite long-lasting and lead to substantial increases in mood and focus throughout the day. Many people out there hear about deliberate cold exposure and cringe. Other people hear about it and cringe because they've heard that deliberate cold exposure, especially by way of immersion in water, can block the adaptation to strength or hypertrophy training. What I mean by that is, yes, indeed, there are data showing that if one gets into very cold water up to the neck in the 6 hours, anytime that is, in the 6 hours after strength or hypertrophy training, that some of the strength and hypertrophy increases that one would observe are blocked by that deliberate cold exposure. However, after 6 hours does not seem to be a problem. So it can be done on other days besides the strength and hypertrophy training. It can be done before strength and hypertrophy training. It can be done after endurance work. And I should mention that it does not appear that cold showers disrupt the adaptations to strength and hypertrophy training, even if they are done immediately after strength or hypertrophy training. Okay, with that said, many people do enjoy the effects of deliberate cold exposure, in particular for those increases in mood and alertness that are the consequence of those increases in the catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And again, those increases are very long lasting. So it's not just during the exposure to cold, it is for several hours, up to 4, maybe even 5 or 6 hours, depending on how cold and how long the deliberate cold exposure happens to be. I definitely want to share with you the results of this recent study that just came out. The title of this study is Impact of Cold Exposure on Life Satisfaction and Physical Composition of Soldiers. The reason this study is very interesting is that it's one of the few studies that used, or I should say, explored both deliberate cold exposure by immersion in cold water, as well as deliberate cold exposure by way of cold showers as it relates to weight loss. Now, there's already data out there on the effects of deliberate cold exposure and metabolism. People that do 11 minutes total of deliberate cold exposure by immersion in cold water up to the neck per week, so 11 minutes per week total, spread out across some different sessions by way of getting into water that's uncomfortably cold up to the neck, and then getting out, and then doing that several times per week to hit that 11 minutes or more threshold. And this is very important, will come up in a moment in the context of this new study, and warming up not by getting into a warm shower, which is frankly what I do after my cold showers, or getting into the ice bath or cold water immersion, but rather forcing their body to warm up naturally by using its own metabolic abilities. In those studies, they observed substantial increases in brown fat stores, which are fat stores that you really want around the heart and clavicles, increases in metabolism that were quite dramatic, in my opinion, and that could be very beneficial for allowing people to feel more comfortable at cold temperatures when they're not in cold water, and on and on. So lots of benefits shown in that study. In this study, what I thought was particularly interesting is, again, they explored both immersion in cold water and cold showers, and the duration of cold exposure that they found led to substantial fat loss, especially around the abdomen, was very brief deliberate cold exposure. Let me give you a few details about this study. The study involved 49 subjects that include both males and females. This is also really important. The beautiful work of Susanna Soberg and colleagues, as far as I know, only looked at males. This study looked at males and females. They were 19 to 30 years old. And there basically were two groups. People who either were assigned to get deliberate cold exposure or they were not assigned to deliberate cold exposure. The form of deliberate cold exposure involved one session per week of cold immersion in cold water up to the neck. And to just give you a sense of how cold it was 3 degrees Celsius, which translates to about 37.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty darn cold, but it was only for 2 minutes. The critical feature of this study is, as with the beautiful work by Susanna Soberg, the subjects were told to warm up naturally after the deliberate cold exposure. So they basically hung out outside of the cold water immersion or outside of the cold shower for 10 minutes after they were exposed to the cold. in their bathing suit, or I'm assuming they were wearing something. But the point is that you are not going from deliberate cold exposure directly into a hot shower or a sauna or something of that sort. So again, their bodies were forced to heat up again naturally after the deliberate cold exposure. But after the 10-minute period, they were able to do whatever they wanted, essentially reclothe, take a warm shower, and so on, and go about their day. Now, the deliberate cold exposure used in this study caused many different statistically significant positive changes. They had a very extensive questionnaire that related to mood, everything from levels of anxiety to sexual satisfaction, and on and on. In fact, they saw a statistically significant improvement in sexual satisfaction in the subjects that were exposed to deliberate cold exposure, not in the control group. Although they didn't look at this, chances are those improvements in sexual satisfaction were the downstream consequence of the known increases in testosterone and free testosterone that occur in both men and women who do this sorts of deliberate cold exposure. Again, testosterone being an important hormone for libido in both men and women. They also saw improvements in regulation of anxiety, which I think is very interesting, given that the deliberate cold exposure often causes people anxiety. But here and in other studies, we've seen it can lead to a better ability to buffer against anxiety in the normal happenings of everyday life. Perhaps the most interesting and significant results that they found in the study, however, were that in particular in men, there was a reduction in waist circumference following 8 weeks of this deliberate cold exposure, as well as a 5.5%, on average, 5.5% reduction in abdominal fat that was quite statistically significant.